So, first of all, America's deregulatory binge. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, we began to hear that it involved, among other things, some mysterious financial instrument called credit default swaps. This is a kind of insurance used by investors for speculation and hedging. And by the time the mortgage crisis hit, the market in credit default swaps was valued at $62 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars. And that's almost 4 times the total value of the U.S. stock market itself. Now, the market in credit default swaps was unregulated. And thanks to legislation that was spearheaded by Republican Texas Senator Phil Gramm in 2000, the federal government was expressly barred from regulating credit default swaps. In other words, this lack of adult supervision in that market was intentional. But that was just one part of an overall deregulatory binge that has been going on since the late years of the Carter administration, but really picked up under Ronald Reagan. And this deregulatory binge was driven by an ideology of self-interest and almost religious faith in the benefits of the unrestrained self-interest of market players. Now, according to this ideology, the best way to achieve social benefits, such as ending poverty or protecting consumers and investors, is to let individuals pursue their own personal self-interest without government hindrance, the term that's often used. Hindrance being oversight, regulation, taxation, that sort of thing. Now, this is known, some of you will be familiar with this as the doctrine of the invisible hand, or unintended consequences, the doctrine of unintended consequences, which goes back to the 1700s, to the prophet of free market capitalism, Adam Smith. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith makes the paradoxical claim that social good may arise naturally as an unintended consequence of individuals pursuing their own self-interest. Smith argues that we don't expect our dinner to come from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker, but from their regard to their own self-interest, their self-love. The baker, according to Smith, doesn't make our bread out of benevolence or out of the kindness of her heart, but in order to make a profit, self-love. Now, we might note here the dualism, the either-or thinking in Smith's argument here. We have either benevolence or self-love. Let's just file that away for future reference. We'll come back to it later. Now, economist John Eichard sums up Smith's argument this way. Pursuit of short-run self-interest is transformed into achievement of the public good as if by an invisible hand. The greatest societal good results from the greatest individual greed. Now, more recently, there have been libertarian economists in the Smithian tradition, such as Walter Williams, who take Smith's argument even further. Williams argues that taxation and regulation amount to government confiscation of private property. And he claims that persons acting in their own self-interest will do voluntarily what is in the social interest. And he gives an example. Although he personally doesn't care much about future generations, he decides to plant trees on his property because it will raise his property resale value. So, Williams argues, by acting in his own self-interest, he then benefits future generations, even though that benefit was not his intent. And then he argues also that by interfering with one's freedom to use one's private property, taxation and government regulation interfere with the attainment of socially desirable outcomes. Okay, so the government then is stopping people from producing these unintended benefits by regulating them or taxing them. Now, I think you'll admit that this is a very odd idea. It's a very strange idea that the greatest good comes from the greatest greed, right? But it became common sense in the 1980s and 1990s among Republicans, definitely, but also among a whole lot of Democrats. And so long as the Dow Jones soared to record levels, too few of us took a hard look at it. But a decade ago, John Eichert, the economist I mentioned earlier, identified a major flaw in this ideology of self-interest. Eichert observed that contemporary economic thought reduces the market to nothing more than a collection of independent, individual consumers, and reduces economic values to our narrow, short-run self-interest. Economics, Eichert wrote, is fundamentally incapable of dealing with relationships among people. It's incapable of dealing with relationships among people. And he's an economist saying that about his own field. And instead, the libertarian economic ideology that drove our deregulatory binge sees persons as essentially separate individuals, kind of like billiard balls on a billiard table, right? They occasionally bump into one another, but apart from that, they remain pretty much essentially separate and disconnected from the others. Well, it was that kind of thinking that lay behind Ronald Reagan's famous declaration that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. In the wake of the Reagan Revolution, the edifice of federal regulation erected since the New Deal in the 1930s was progressively dismantled throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And as a result, the health of the economy, the safety of investors, and the livelihoods of millions of Americans were entrusted to the self-interest of the players in the financial markets. I've got to hand it to advocates of deregulation. They did a really good job of spinning this, right? They did a really good job of selling the idea of unintended consequences and the need for deregulation and the miracle of the market. You've all heard that, right? Miracle of the market. But what they neglected to mention is that the unrestrained pursuit of self-interest can also have negative consequences. And this fact has become quite clear in the cascading chain of causes, kind of snowballing causes that led to our current economic crisis. Now, in the article, I discuss, probably too briefly, the process by which these different financial instruments like credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations and so on actually contributed to the crisis. I'm not going to go into that here because I don't fully understand it. Economists don't fully understand it. So I would suggest that if you want to pursue that, you can feel free to read the article. Better, check out Gretchen Morganson's really excellent reporting, the New York Times. She did some excellent work back during 2008, 2009 in kind of clarifying, demystifying the nature of the crisis.